The move, the Thompson family had always dreamed of a bigger house. With 2 growing children, Emily and Jack, and a dog named Max, their old 2-bedroom home felt increasingly cramped. When they stumbled upon a listing for a sprawling Victorian house at an unbelievably low price, they couldn't resist. The real estate agent, a peculiar woman with a knowing smile, assured them the house was special. Little did they know just how special it would turn out to be. The house stood at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street, its tall spires and intricate woodwork giving it an air of grandeur. The moment they stepped inside, they felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the house had been waiting for them. The rooms were spacious, the walls adorned with vintage wallpaper, and the floors creaked with the weight of history. It was perfect. The first night in the house was uneventful, but when they woke up the next morning, something was different. The hallway leading to the bedrooms seemed longer than they remembered, and there was a new door at the end of it. Curious, they opened it to find a small, cozy library filled with books they had never seen before. The shelves were dusty, but the room had an inviting warmth. "This is amazing," Emily exclaimed, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "It's like the house knew we needed a library." Her father, Mark, chuckled. Maybe the previous owners just forgot to mention it. Houses don't just grow new rooms overnight. But over the next few days, more rooms began to appear. A sunlit conservatory with lush plants, a playroom filled with toys for Jack, and even a small gym for Sarah, Mark's wife. At first, it was exciting, like living in a magical wonderland. But soon, the novelty began to wear off, replaced by a creeping unease. The new rooms were always perfect, tailored to their desires, but they appeared without warning, often when no one was looking. The family started to notice strange details. The faint sound of whispering in empty rooms, shadows that moved on their own, and a cold draft that seemed to follow them wherever they went. One night, Mark decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the newly appeared basement, which hadn't been there the day before. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, he found a room filled with old photographs and trinkets, all of them eerily familiar. "Is it another new room? Can I see?" "No!" Mark snapped more harshly than he intended. Emily flinched, and he immediately regretted his tone. He knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's just, this house isn't what we thought it was. Something's wrong here, and I need to figure out what's going on. Please, go back to bed." Emily nodded reluctantly and shuffled back to her room, casting one last glance at the mysterious door. Mark waited until he heard her door close before turning his attention back to the tapping. It had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Taking a deep breath, Mark pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were covered in shifting patterns, like ink swirling in water, and the air was thick with a metallic scent. In the center of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror, its surface dark and reflective. As Mark approached, he saw his own reflection, but it wasn't quite right. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, and his expression twisted with fear. "Welcome, Mark," a voice echoed through the room, though no one was there. "You've finally found me." Mark spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the room was empty. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" The mirror's surface rippled, and the voice spoke again, this time from within it. "I am the heart of this house, the architect of its growth. I feed on your fears, your memories, your desires. And you, Mark Thompson, have much to offer." Mark stumbled back, his mind reeling. "This is insane. Houses don't talk. They don't grow." "Ah, but I am no ordinary house," the voice replied, its tone almost amused. "I am alive, and I have chosen your family to be my guests. You will stay here, and you will feed me until there is nothing left of you." "No," Mark said firmly, though his legs felt like they might give out. "We're leaving. Tonight." The voice laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Mark's spine. "You can try. But the house has already claimed you. There is no escape. Before Mark could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for the doorknob, but it was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken wood. Panic surged through him as he realized he was trapped. The mirror's gaze. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he pressed his hands against the walls of the room, searching for any sign of a hidden exit. The shifting patterns on the walls seemed to pulse under his touch, as if the house itself was alive and watching him. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, making his head spin. "Let me out!" he shouted, pounding on the walls. "Do you hear me? Let me out!" The voice from the mirror chuckled, low and menacing. "There is no escape, Mark. Not unless I allow it." Mark turned to face the mirror, his reflection still distorted and unsettling. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. "Why are you doing this?" The mirror's surface rippled again, and the voice grew softer, almost coaxing. "I want your fear, Mark, your deepest, darkest fears. They sustain me, nourish me, and you have so much to give." Mark's mind raced. He thought of his family, Sarah, Emily, Jack, and even Max. They were all in danger, and he was powerless to help them. The realization filled him with a desperate anger. "I won't let you hurt them," he said, his voice steadying. "If you want fear, take it from me. Leave my family alone." The mirror's surface shimmered, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of something. An image of Sarah, her face pale and terrified, standing in a room he didn't recognize. Then it was gone, replaced by his own twisted reflection. "Your fear is delicious," the voice purred, "but it is not enough. I need more. I need all of you." Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out. He couldn't let the house win. He had to protect his family, no matter the cost. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection looming larger and more distorted with each step. "If you want my fear," he said, his voice low and determined, "then take it, but I won't make it easy for you." The room seemed to hold its breath, the air growing heavier. Mark reached out and touched the mirror's surface, expecting it to be cold and hard. Instead, it was warm, almost alive. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through him, and he was pulled forward into the mirror. The labyrinth. Mark stumbled as he was thrust into the mirror, his surroundings shifting in a dizzying blur. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were made of dark, polished wood, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors of all shapes and sizes, each one slightly ajar, as if inviting him to enter. "Where am I?" Mark muttered, his voice echoing down the hallway. He turned in a circle, trying to orient himself, but there was no sign of the mirror he had just stepped through. The house had swallowed him whole. The voice from the mirror spoke again, though it seemed to come from all around him now. "Welcome to the labyrinth, Mark. This is where your fears take shape. Each door holds a piece of your past, your present, and your future. Will you face them, or will you run?" Mark clenched his fists, his determination hardening. He couldn't afford to run. His family was still out there, and he had to find a way back to them. Steeling himself, he approached the nearest door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small and cluttered, filled with childhood memorabilia. A toy train set sat on the floor, its tracks winding in a chaotic loop. Mark's breath caught as he recognized it. It was the train set he had loved as a boy, the one his father had thrown away after a particularly bad fight. The memory of that day came rushing back, sharp and painful. "Why did you do it, Mark?" a voice whispered from the shadows. Mark turned to see a figure standing in the corner of the room, a younger version of himself, no more than 10 years old, clutching the broken pieces of the train set. "You could have stopped him. You could have stood up to him." Mark's chest tightened. "I was just a kid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how." The younger Mark stared at him, his eyes filled with accusation. "You still don't. Before Mark could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, and the room began to dissolve, the walls melting into darkness. He was thrust back into the corridor, his heart pounding. The house was playing with him, forcing him to confront his deepest regrets. He moved to the next door, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond. This time, the room was a hospital ward, sterile and cold. Sarah lay in a bed, her face pale and drawn, hooked up to machines that beeped monotonously. Emily and Jack stood at her side, their faces streaked with tears. "No," Mark whispered, stepping forward. "This isn't real, isn't it?" Sarah's voice was weak, but her eyes bore into his. "You've always been so focused on work, Mark. What if something happens to me? What if you're not there when we need you most?" Mark's throat tightened. "I'm here now," he said, reaching for her hand. But before he could touch her, the room dissolved again, leaving him back in the corridor. The voice of the house echoed around him, taunting. "You see, Mark, your fears are endless, and I will feast on them until there is nothing left." Mark sank to his knees, overwhelmed. But as he sat there, a spark of defiance ignited within him. He couldn't let the house win. He had to find a way out, not just for himself, but for his family. Standing up, he began to walk down the corridor, ignoring the doors that whispered and beckoned. He focused on the sound of his own breathing, the rhythm of his footsteps, anything to drown out the house's taunts. And then, at the end of the corridor, he saw it. A faint glimmer of light, barely visible through the darkness. He quickened his pace, hope surging within him. But as he drew closer, the light began to flicker, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The house was toying with him again, trying to break his resolve. "Not this time," Mark muttered, forcing himself to keep moving. "I'm getting out of here." The heart of the house. Mark's legs burned as he forced himself to keep moving toward the flickering light. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around him, but he refused to stop. He could feel the house's presence pressing down on him, its whispers growing louder, more desperate, as if it sensed his determination. "You cannot escape me, Mark," the house's voice hissed, echoing through the labyrinth. "You are mine. I'm not yours," Mark growled through gritted teeth. "And I'm not afraid of you." The light ahead grew brighter, and Mark pushed himself harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, he burst into a large circular chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of him. Some young, some old, some broken, some defiant. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating core, its surface dark and oily, like a living shadow. This was the heart of the house. Mark approached the core cautiously, his heart pounding. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. The core pulsed, and the house's voice emanated from it, deeper and more resonant than before. "You think you can destroy me? I am your fears, your regrets, your darkest thoughts. You cannot destroy what is a part of you." Mark hesitated, the words striking a chord within him. The house was right. It had been feeding on his fears, his memories, his weaknesses, but it had also shown him something else. His strength, his love for his family, his determination to protect them. That was something the house couldn't take from him. "You're wrong," Mark said, his voice rising. "You're not just my fears. You're my past, and I won't let my past control my future." He reached out and placed his hand on the core. It was cold and slimy, and a wave of nausea washed over him as images flooded his mind. His father's anger, Sarah's illness, Emily and Jack's tears. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he focused on the good memories. Sarah's laughter, Emily's first steps, Jack's wide-eyed wonder at the world. He thought of Max, wagging his tail as he greeted them at the door. He thought of the love that bound them all together. The core began to tremble, its surface cracking as light seeped through the fissures. "No!" the house screamed, its voice filled with panic. "You cannot do this." "Yes, I can," Mark said, his voice firm. Because I'm not afraid of you anymore." With a final, deafening crack, the core shattered, and the room was flooded with blinding light. Mark shielded his eyes as the mirrors around him exploded, their shards dissolving into nothingness. The walls of the labyrinth crumbled, and the house's presence faded, its whispers silenced. When the light dimmed, Mark found himself standing in the living room of the Victorian house. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the house's influence gone. The walls no longer shifted, and the strange, metallic scent had disappeared. The house was just a house again. "Mark!" Sarah's voice called from the hallway. He turned to see her running toward him, Emily and Jack close behind. They looked shaken but unharmed. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her eyes searching his face. "We couldn't find you. The house, it felt like it was alive." "It's over," Mark said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's over." Emily and Jack clung to his legs, their small faces filled with relief. Max barked happily, wagging his tail as if nothing had happened. As the family stood together in the quiet house, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The house had tried to consume them, but it had failed. They had faced their fears and come out stronger. In the days that followed, the house remained still. No new rooms appeared, and the strange occurrences ceased. The Thompsons decided to stay, determined to reclaim the house as their home. They filled it with laughter, love, and new memories, pushing back the shadows that had once threatened to consume them. And in the deepest part of the house, where the heart had once pulsed with dark energy, there was only silence. The house had been defeated, not by force, but by the strength of a family's love.